Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very timely and important Utah Valley Earth Forum online event. I'm James Westwater, Chair of the UVEF. I want to thank our expert panelists, our environmental partners, Conserve Utah Valley and Conserve Utah Lake Coalition, and everyone who has been working to help our great public treasure, Utah Lake. Everyone should know that our health and well-being depend on the health and well-being of where we live. If we take good care of where we live, the environment, nature, the earth, it will take good care of us. When we abuse it, we're in big trouble. Utah Lake is the most distinctive natural feature that defines Utah Valley. Since the mid-1800s, when non-natives arrived in Utah, Utah Lake has suffered at our hands. More about this later. Fortunately, many efforts are underway and have been for quite some time to help heal and restore the lake. Utah Lake is recovering, which brings us to the topic of tonight's event, Restoring Utah Lake, What is the Science? To address this question, we assembled a team of distinguished experts. We invited Lake Restoration Solutions, the company proposing to restore Utah Lake by dredging it and building their own large private island city complex scattered across the lake, to join the panel discussion, but they did not respond to repeated requests. Helping to facilitate the discussion tonight is one of our panelists, Patrick Belmont, professor and head of the Utah State University Watershed Sciences Department. So that brings us to introducing tonight's distinguished panel. But before we begin, I'd like to make an important announcement. The Utah Valley Earth Forum is pleased to announce tonight that we are presenting BYU professor Dr. Ben Abbott the Earth Guardian Award in special recognition of his outstanding efforts to help the environment, especially Utah Lake. Congratulations, Ben. Okay, now I will turn it over to Dr. Belmont.
Thank you, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Jim said, I'm the Department Head of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University. I'm here to welcome you all. I appreciate that we're all here with the intention of restoring Utah Lake and making Utah Lake the best Utah Lake it can be. And I think we bring a lot of shared values. We're here to talk about some of those values. We're here to talk about the science. We're here to talk about the future. I've kind of separated the questions we're going to start off talking about into three broad themes. We'll spend a little bit of time talking specifically about Utah Lake. I want to make sure that everyone understands what Utah Lake is and humans' relationship to the lake over time. Second broad theme will be about restoration. I want to make sure that we have a conversation about what restoration really is and what are we trying to restore and how do we restore things like lake systems that are this large. And then the third theme that we'll get to is about the future. What are the range of possibilities in the future? Where do we go from here? Just a couple of ground rules. If everyone who's not a panelist could mute, I would greatly appreciate it. I think Jim has the power to mute people if somebody forgets to mute. But just let's be respectful of the panelists and of all the participants who have taken their time to be here. If you have questions, I'd ask that you put them in the chat. You can put them in the chat for everyone to see, or you can send them directly to me. That's an option in the chat option there. So We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. I'll try to work them in as we're going through the questions that we have already thought about for tonight. And there may be some additional questions that we'll get to. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists, and maybe they can give a brief introduction of themselves. And maybe I'll just go in, maybe I'll just call on Keith, and then we can popcorn around the panelists. So you call on the next person to introduce themselves. So Keith.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. My name is Keith Hambrecht. I'm the Invasive Species Coordinator for the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And my background is actually in engineering. But when I finished my master's in engineering, I realized that what drew me to engineering was problem solving and working on a team to collaboratively solve problems. However, the problems that I wanted to solve were environmental in nature. So I pivoted away from engineering, and I stumbled my way to where I am now with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And so in my role there, I am on the ground project coordinator, and I've spent the last over 6 years working on coordinating collaborative efforts to remove invasive Phragmites from Great Salt Lake, Utah Lake, and Jordan River, and hopefully restore native plant communities and restore habitat. And so I think what I can bring to the conversation tonight is just an example of taking science and applying it on the ground at Utah Lake through a public management agency that manages the lake. And from there, I will pass it over to Sam.
Sam, you're muted. You're still muted, Sam. Let's go with someone else while Sam.
There,
there he is.
I got it.
Good.
Too much technology. I'm Sam Rushforth. I've been working on the lake since 1970. I took my first algal sample on the lake in September of 1970. So that's a long time ago, before many of you were born. And I've looked at the lake ever since, almost every year. So I know I've seen historical trends. I've seen the lake change dramatically. And I suppose I can talk about that a little bit as we go along. And basically what I have focused on are the algae of the lake and algal blooms. So that's my background, and that's where I am. Next person will be Kevin Shurtleff.
Thanks, Sam. I'm Kevin Shurtleff. I'm a professor of chemistry, or associate professor of chemistry at Utah Valley University. I've come to the party a little late. I started looking at Utah Lake 6 years ago in terms of what technology we maybe could develop to help mitigate harmful algal blooms. I'm the director of the Utah Valley University Algae Harvesting Boat Project, and we just completed my students. Well, I really say it was my students and less me, because I didn't ever go out on the boat very much, but they finished a successful season from May to August of going out on the lake every weekday and removing algae through our algae harvesting boat filtration system. And we feel it was very successful, and we're still now compiling the data, and hopefully we can release that soon. But it was sure a lot of fun. At least the students said it was fun to be out on the lake every day. And it's a beautiful lake, by the way. We love it. Okay, I'll pass it on to, is it Brian?
Yes. I'm Dr. Brian Minch, president of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. We're one of the largest civic organizations of physicians in the Western United States, with about 450 physicians and about 300 or 3,000 members of the lay public. Our focus is on the various types of public health consequences of many and varied environmental degradation events. And our focus more specifically in Utah is on air pollution. And we are concerned that there are some air pollution consequences in the works for what and how we manage our lakes, Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake. So I'm here to represent that sort of perspective. And I'll hand it off to Janice.
Hi, I'm Janice Brainy. I'm an associate professor in the Watershed Sciences Department at Utah State University. I'm an environmental scientist who focuses on water quality, specifically in lakes and streams. And I also do a lot of work using sediments to reconstruct historical conditions of lake systems. So I've been leading a project on Utah Lake trying to reconstruct its historical ecology and nutrient and abundance. I also serve on the Utah Lake Water Quality Science Panel. And I will pass it to Ben.
Thanks, Janice. I'm Ben Abbott, an assistant professor of ecosystem ecology at Brigham Young University. And I focus on aquatic ecosystems, lakes, streams, groundwater. And like Kevin, I'm a newcomer to the Utah Lake scene. I grew up here in Utah Valley, exploring the lake, but didn't start studying it until I got to BYU about 5 years ago. And since that time, I've been really learning from all of you a lot and really excited to work with the public and students on Utah Lake. And I think, is that everybody or do we miss? Patrick,
That's everybody, yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll just jump in with some questions here. So we can start with this about Utah Lake section, just to make sure everybody understands what we know about Utah Lake at this point. The first settlers came to Utah Lake probably somewhere around 20,000 years ago. And other pioneers came about 150 years ago. Let's talk a little bit about what the history of Utah Lake is over this time period. What does Utah Lake look like 20,000 years ago and 150 years ago?
Well, I can start just a little bit. I spent some time back in the day looking at journals of people who had looked at Utah Lake. And one of the things that they noted is when they came to the point of the mountain from Salt Lake Valley, they would talk about this blue, lovely, crystal clear lake in the bottom of the valley. But when they got nearer to the lake, it wasn't crystal clear at all. It was somewhat cloudy, and the early people who went on the lake were very amazed at the amount of emergent vegetation. When they were approaching the east shore from the west, they weren't sure where to call the shoreline because of the abundance of emergent vegetation. The other thing I will say, Janice has been looking at some cores, and we've looked at some cores. Utah Lake is a really remarkable body of water. It has a total of nearly 700 species of algae, which is pretty much unheard of, and that includes all of the diatoms. So it's a remarkable body of water. It's changed dramatically through the time that some other people will talk about it, but the early lake was rather different than it looks now.
I can follow up on that. Our sediment cores definitely do show that prior to European settlement that there was abundant macrophyte cover around the Goshen Bay area, as well as on the eastern side of the lake. And since then, after carp introduction, it appears there was a dramatic shift in the way the lake was producing biomass. It moved from the benthic area, the bottom of the lake, up into the water column. And through the last century, there has been a shift in the type of algal communities that have been present. Historically, we saw a lot of healthy communities like diatoms, different diatom species dominating the algal community, which has slowly transitioned into cyanobacteria and green algae. And we see that occurring commensurate with population growth.
There were a lot of different kinds of healthy algae in there before, and now it's shifted to what we might think of as an unhealthy algal community. And There are a lot of words in there. I want to play a little bit of jargon police here and make sure we've got a diverse audience here. So there's macrophytes thrown in there, emergent vegetation. We're just talking about plants that are growing through the water column. So a lot more of Utah Lake would have looked more like a wetland. It's safe to say.
Yeah, and one of the things that is often misunderstood, people think that Utah Lake is shallower now than it used to be naturally. But in fact, the opposite is true. The lake used to be even shallower than it is today. And when the flow control structure was installed at the Jordan River, the one surface outlet of the lake, it raised the lake level by about 3 feet. And so again, I think it is helpful to compare the lake to a wetland. And wetlands are, of course, some of the most productive and important ecosystems for habitat, for biogeochemical cycling, and for carbon sequestration.
So Ben, if you wanted to restore the lake, you would not make it deeper.
Certainly not. Yeah. The last time that Utah Lake was really deep was before it was Utah Lake, when it was part of the Lake Bonneville system, right? And at that time it was 400 or 500 feet deep. But of course, that was an inland sea about the size of Lake Michigan that covered almost all of the area that's currently developed along the Wasatch Front.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts on historical Utah Lake?
Could I just add that not all cyanobacteria produces the toxins that we call harmful algal blooms. So, you know, cyanobacteria, I don't know if you could say they're beneficial, but they're not necessarily harmful in the lake.
Got it. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, one additional thing, Patrick. We talk sometimes about water quality or hydrology or the different species that are there as if they're independent things. And, you know, those are all connected. The reason why you have this amazing diversity of different types of algae and different kinds of birds is because of the habitat and hydrology of Utah Lake. And so I just encourage everyone to think of the system as a connected, integrated system, which now, of course, includes people. And so one of the things that I think is really distinctive about Utah Lake in its entire history is that it occurs in the Great Basin, you know, this semi-arid region. And so it's really a precious ecosystem type for the humans that live here and for all of the amazing animal, plant, and microbial life.
I'll just follow that just for a little bit. When I was taking those samples early in the 70s, the dominant players were cyanobacteria at the time, Dolichospermum and the Phanoxamenon, and then there was a dinoflagellate, the same ones that are causing the harmful blooms now. So we may have blooms that have increased in size. I'm not sure that's really the case. But at least since the 70s, we've had these harmful algal blooms going on.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about humans' relationship with the lake and how that's changed over time, how people have viewed the lake in the past, how people are viewing the lake today, and what role does it really play for people who are living in Utah Valley and people who visit here? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I can say that my first introduction to the lake was when I was 16. So that would have been late 1970s. And I used to go water skiing on the lake. And as Sam just mentioned, there were definitely algal blooms back then. We didn't realize, I didn't realize as a 16-year-old that they potentially were harmful, but I still have water skis to this day that are stained green from Utah Lake. But it used to be a great place to water ski. And I think it's probably even better today to water ski on Utah Lake. So, you know, I think the problem is people see marshland, these vegetation zones as not beautiful. It's all a matter of perspective, right? From my perspective, I think those areas are beautiful because that's what harbors lots of different plant life and animal life and things like that. So I find them beautiful, but people don't really like muddy areas or swamps, as they like to call them. And that's unfortunate. But the cool thing about Utah Lake is you don't have to stay in those zones. There's lots of much nicer water areas around the lake, as well as those other marshland areas.
Well, one thing just to follow up quickly on that too is I just received a comment. Utah Lake is not the only lake in the West or even in the United States to have these blooms. Algal blooms are in many of the lakes in North America, including clear in those in the Northeast where it's cool and the water is better quality. So algal blooms are common. They're not uncommon, and it's not. It's just not. Shoot, I'm in and out of the lake every summer. I've swum in the lake probably for 50 straight years. I have yet to have any problems with the lake. The lake's a treasure. It's just unfortunate that some people don't know that.
And just to add briefly, that Lake Tahoe is over 300 feet deep in many spots, and it is also having problems during today with harmful algal blooms. So the depth of the lake really isn't a significant indicator of whether you're going to have algal blooms or not. I think that's an important point to remember.
Can anyone speak directly to the amount of recreation that occurs on the lake? We have numbers on that.
I looked relatively recently at the state park visitation numbers. So Utah Lake is also unique in that how accessible it is, right? The communities exist all around it. And if you compare that to other water bodies that you travel to, it's easier to get visitation numbers there. But just over the past few years, there's been an increase in visitation. Now in 2015 is when the algal bloom limits were changed as far as what would be reported as an algal bloom on the lake. And there definitely was a marked decrease in 2015 and the years after that in visitation. But that wasn't associated with an increase in algal activity. It's just a difference in how we communicate, public health risk about the lake. And then I also was speaking with or saw a video of the Bonneville Sailing Club, which is a really cool group that teaches people who don't have any experience and also don't have boats like me, how to actually sail. And they mentioned that they've seen more than a doubling in enrollment in the lake. So it's cool to see people turning back to the lake and discovering it and appreciating it in so many different ways.
Brian, go ahead.
Just to note, there's been some interesting comments and questions in the chat. If you guys,
I was going to get to those. Yeah, there've been a couple questions about human impacts on the lake. So Cole Kelly asked, "What is the impact of Geneva steel on Utah Lake?" Zachary Chase asks, "Is the algae from farming, or how did the excessive amount of nutrients get in the lake?"
Well, I'll just take a whack at that as a starter. The initial harm to the lake came from the early settlers in the valley. In fact, many of you know, some of you don't. The lake it had some native species of trout, plus the June sucker were very, very important species for protein for the early settlers. And unfortunately, the fish would come up the rivers to spawn, and the pioneers would pitchfork them out, and they harvested tons of the things. And in fact, for those of you who know the concept, they hauled them by the wagon load to Salt Lake City, and they were a very important source of protein in Salt Lake City. The unfortunate thing was they did a certain amount of overfishing, but more importantly, they also began irrigating, and they had no return flow containment whatsoever. So the spawning beds got silted up, the lake got silted up, and those species began to disappear. And that was a huge loss to not only the pioneers, but to the people in Salt Lake and others. And then changes have gone on since that others can address.
I'd like to speak to that, if you don't mind, folks. I'm Forrest Kutch. I'm an elder of the Ute Indian tribe.
Please, thank you, Forrest.
Yeah, and thanks for the invite to this meeting. I've been wanting to get involved in this issue for some time now because I'm very concerned about the future of the lake. There's already been enough destruction to it. And then I'm just really abhorred of the idea of creating islands for more housing development. I mean, it just makes me sick to think that people would consider such a development. But I would like to speak to the history of the lake. My people, those were the homelands of the Uinta and the Timpanowats and some of the other bands of the Ute Indian people. And we've learned recently, various scholars have indicated that it appears that 30% of our diet came from the fishery, the Utah Lake. Not only the suckers, but the Bonneville cutthroat trout was one of the main sources before the lake became polluted. There's even a recent study to indicate that the tribe appointed captains to some of the major lakes in Utah, not only Utah Lake, but Fish Lake, and I think another lake, Sevier possibly, to count the spawn and determine the harvest and determine how many other tribes and bands to invite to the fall harvest, in which these fish were caught and smoked for the winter. And so one of the things we found out is that the reason our tribes it took another 100 years to utilize the horse after our Colorado relatives had already accessed the horse from the Spanish. We didn't adopt it right away because we didn't depend on red meat as much as the Colorado Utes. Fish was one of our staple diets. And so, according to the book On Zion Mount by Jared Farmer, he confirms a lot of this information about our people. And so, as an indigenous person who was removed from our homelands, and we don't relate to that area as much as we once did, nor do we relate to areas of Colorado that my father's people were removed from. We still value nature, and we're concerned about pollution, not only of the water, but the air and the soil itself.
Right.
And so when I gave a talk to some students at Brigham Young University a couple of years ago, I challenged them to think about cleaning up the lake. And those students were very interested. I was very impressed with their enthusiasm. And so, same with you folks, I would like to see all of the resources brought to clean up the lake and make it as healthy as possible. And I'm not one I'm an environmentalist and conservationist, but I'm not the kind that proposes going to war and taking food off of people's tables. But I do believe in dialogue and discussion and diplomacy and doing everything we can do to create a healthy environment, and not only for one group, but for all people.
Thank you.
And so I just wanted to share that with you folks, that that's the concern I have as an indigenous person whose people once thrived and lived a good life in that area at one time. So
thank you, Forrest.
Thank you, Forrest. Appreciate your insights. Brian, you got your hands up.
Do you want to say, mostly it is the panel discussing, and if someone has a question that they'd like to ask, they can use the reactions button down at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand.
Yeah, please use the chat for now.
Yeah. use the chat for now.
We'll get
Thank
to
you.
a point in the evening where we can have more people speaking up, but for right now, I'd like for the questions to be in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat and I'll bring those questions in as we're able to. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, while we're talking about the fish in the lake, I just wanted to mention that proposals such as those from LRS to essentially poison the entire lake, which would be a massive undertaking with a pesticide, albeit a natural one known as rotenone. Rotenone is toxic not only to fish and to insects, but also to humans and animals. If you look at a toxicology textbook, rotenone is listed as toxic to human and animals. And in mammals, the acute toxicity of rotenone is considered moderate and varies widely between species and within species. So if anyone has an idea that we can, with some sort of magic wand called rotenone, transform the lake and get rid of invasive carp species and replace that with native trout and other native fish, that's really a fantasy, because that's a real environmental cost to do it that way. And it has significant health hazard implications for the entire community. One of which is the fact that we know that the compound actually does not disintegrate in water in less than 6 months. And the massive size of Utah Lake would require so much pesticide that there is no question that the entire community would be exposed to that poison.
That's right.
And that is a real potential disaster, especially for children and pregnant mothers and babies in utero.
Agreed.
That's a terrific comment. And furthermore, when Strawberry Reservoir was poisoned with rotenone, back in the day, 15 years ago or so, it was marginally successful, but it took all of the rotenone in the entire world for 2 years to poison Strawberry. There is no way we could gather enough rotenone to poison Utah Lake. Thank goodness, because I'm absolutely with you, Brian. It's a nasty substance that is very deadly to good and bad. Well, good and bad. I hate to use that term, but to all the organisms of the lake and beyond.
Well, its toxicity is to general biological systems. So virtually all of us share those kinds of biological systems with the fish and the insects that are its target.
Yep.
So we got a question about specifically what caused the lake to transform from bottom growth to cyanobacteria growth, this really harmful, potentially harmful algae. Could Janice or someone else tackle that question? What really caused that shift in how the lake functions?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We saw a really dramatic shift in the late 19th century, which occurred about the time that carp were introduced into the lake system. And we know that carp can be very destructive to vegetation growing on the bottom of a lake. They'll pull it up and disturb the sediments. And once the sediments are disturbed, not enough light can reach the bottom of the lake in order for new growth to occur. It also happened at about the time that the lake level became regulated, and as Ben was talking about, the lake level has increased a little bit since that time, and a higher lake water level will also make it more difficult for benthic macrophytes to establish across the range that it used to occupy.
Thanks, Janice. Could we talk a little bit about the role that Utah Lake plays for wildlife? We've heard little bits and pieces of that, but maybe a summary of the important role Utah Lake plays.
Well, I want to can we talk a little bit more about how we got to where we are today?
Sure.
I don't actually know the answer to this, but I know, I believe Utah Lake is being eutrophied, which means more and more nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer nutrients are being added to the lake. Is that true? Do we see that or not?
We do. I'd also like to point out that David Richards made a really great point in the chat. There were, historically, we find a lot of shells of different gastropods and different mollusks in the sediments that we no longer see. They served a really important role in filtering the lake. They're also really sensitive to pollution. So that's a nice indication of how the lake has changed. We do also see shifts in the nutrient content through time. We've been using a novel method I won't get into to track how much phosphorus has been in the lake through the last 200 years, and we see a pretty dramatic increase in the last 100 years or so.
And that's from man-made activity?
Yes, it's most likely from direct wastewater input into the lake, as well as runoff, ag, and stormwater.
So the reason I wanted to point that out is because I think we need to understand how we got to where we are if we want to, try and roll it back or improve or restore the lake. I think it's important to understand all the issues related to why the
Absolutely.
lake is the way it is.
Yeah,
And
can
some we
anyone
might
speak
be able
to,
change and some we can't.
can anyone speak to how the nutrient loading from wastewater treatment plants is changing now? Have we solved that problem?
can
I
speak
do
a
know
little-
they've reduced the limits on what can be released into the lake in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, but that's only recently. And I think the Department of Water Quality has been working on that now for several years, but still it's a relatively recent requirement where they're reducing the levels that the wastewater facilities can discharge.
Well, that's also an ongoing debate at Utah Lake as to how much can we really do by increasing phosphorus removal from the sewage treatment versus what's in the watershed. And Utah Lake is in the bottom it's a semi-terminal lake in the bottom of a Mesozoic drainage basin that is exceedingly rich in phosphorus. So the lake naturally has high phosphorus, and anything you add on top of it will most likely, in most cases, will increase the growth of cyanobacteria. So, and what happens is you get the changes that Janice is talking about because first off, many cyanobacteria fix their own nitrogen. And then if they get phosphorus boosts, they are very, very competitive. They'll outcompete most other algal species. So that's one of the reasons the change has occurred, is because with the increasing phosphorus. But we'll always have a phosphorus-rich lake. There's no question.
So that brings up a good point that
Landscape
I like to
certainly
discuss, because I think a lot of people misunderstand phosphorus and its role in algal blooms or algae growth, for that matter. So yeah, a lot of people want to reduce the amount of phosphorus in the lake to hopefully make that the growth limiting mechanism. I think that's going to be a real challenge, because if you look at the Redfield molar ratios, which were established for admittedly sea algae, but it's similar to other algae and cyanobacteria, these are the elements that it tells you the molar ratios of the elements you need to produce these algae, these plants, photosynthetic materials. And the ratio is 106 carbon, primarily from carbonates or carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water. 106 of those, 16 nitrogen, 16 moles of nitrogen, and 1 mole of phosphorus. So a lot of people misunderstand that. What that means is that if you have a lot of phosphorus, it's really, you have to reduce the phosphorus level to a very low level before it starts impacting the growth, because the algae don't need a lot of it. And I also think this is why we see higher phosphorus concentrations, because I believe that the growth is nitrogen limited, because you need more nitrogen. So it's easier, the nitrogen is consumed, 16 moles of nitrogen consumed for every mole of phosphorus. So I think it's going to be basically impossible to reduce the phosphorus levels to a point where they'll be limiting. I think it's the nitrogen that becomes growth limiting in these cases. So I just want to make clear that a lot of people misunderstand the Redfield molar ratio and what it means in terms of growth, algal growth or cyanobacteria growth in the lake.
There are a lot of nutrients in there. I want to switch a little bit and start talking about restoration. And what does restoration mean? What are we really going for here? Does anyone want to start off broadly about what we mean when we use the word restoration? Because I think that probably means a lot of different things to different people. I'd like for us to be on the same page for the purposes of this conversation.
Patrick, I'm wondering if you're the person to
Maybe me.
answer that question.
Head of Watershed Sciences and Restoration Consortium here. Well, so I think when a lot of people hear restoration, they initially think that we're trying to bring the lake or stream or whatever it is back to some historical condition. And in some cases that makes sense. But in most cases, we're trying to restore the function, the water quality, the health of the system. And so I think that's the framework we should be thinking about as we're thinking about the wide variety of options that we have available to restore Utah Lake. Anyone want to add anything onto that definition or make any other qualifiers there?
Well, I think it's important to think, yeah, what is restoration? A lot of people think restoration means that we'll make the lake deep and clear, and that's just never has been in the past, and it's really unlikely to happen in the future. So I think we all have to get on the same page of what restoration means, and that means bringing the lake back to. It would be nice to have it back to maybe more benthic growth where we have less green, but it's always going to be turbid because it always has been, and it's just the nature of the lake. So restoring the lake, I don't think means making it deeper and clearer, although I think it could mean that the lake becomes the water quality is improved so that we don't have these harmful algal blooms anymore. People aren't afraid to fish and eat the fish or let their dogs swim in the water, right? So if we can get it to that point, that's the way it was in the past, as one of the commenters somebody commented in the chat, about their dog recently being injured, but not in the past. So for me, restoration means bringing it back to a state where, we don't have to worry about the harmful algal blooms or the toxicity or letting our, recreating in the lake. We don't have to worry about that anymore. We can enjoy it. Even though it may still be turbid, we can still enjoy it.
Right. It's not necessarily going to be Crater Lake or Lake Tahoe clear. Restoration for Utah Lake is a little bit different. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah. So if some entity says, we will restore the lake to a clean, clear, pristine state, that's rather impossible, would you say?
That's not restoration. That's changing changing the whole nature of the lake. I mean, it's not restoration. It's just changing the lake to be what you want it to be instead of what it is.
Especially if you wanted to make it deep and kill all the fish with a super toxic poison that is not really available to do on the scale that is being talked about.
Let's go to Keith.
I just want to add to Patrick's point that I think the important piece is the word process in ecological restoration. So we want to restore the processes that create the ecosystem, and ecosystems are very dynamic. So we're not aiming for, we're going to engineer it into this specific steady state. The approach should be figuring out what the underlying processes are that create that ecosystem so that it can be resilient, staying within the bounds of some healthy area within those processes.
Okay, can some folks speak to what has been done in terms of restoration at Utah Lake already? What's going on right now? Restore some of the water quality, some of the fish populations, things like that.
I could share quite a bit from my perspective for the projects that I've done on Utah Lake, and then I have a little bit to add in the chat as far as some other stuff going on. But Patrick, you had asked the question about wildlife, and so the main project that I've been coordinating for the state is Phragmites removal from Great Salt Lake wetlands and Utah Lake wetlands. And one of the main reasons to remove Phragmites from these wetlands is bird habitat. And so these wetland habitats are shallow water wetland habitats that that the birds require a diverse plant community that also has open water and open space, so that diversity in plant community is what's lost when Phragmites invades these wetlands. And so I've been working for about 6 years now on that effort, and we've significantly reduced Phragmites cover. For Utah Lake, we've reduced it by over 70%. And what we're seeing is a great response from these native plant communities. And so we're not just, what I learned last week is that we're not just seeing bird habitat return, but also pollinator habitat. So we're seeing a lot of native forbs coming back, and in some areas, massive use of monarch butterflies. And so I think from my standpoint, there are folks within public agencies that are currently working on the lake to do restoration, but a key component to that restoration is collaborating with scientists to put the best science on the ground, and learn iteratively as we apply that science on the ground. And there are a lot of similar efforts. So Division of Water Quality has a coordinator that's driving the water quality study. And they're looking specifically at what are the driving factors, the underlying causes for those harmful algal blooms, and how do we get away from that? And Division of Water Quality is the agency tasked with managing water quality on the lake. And then there's the Provo River Delta Project, which is restoring the Provo River Delta. And they're kind of in the mix of, they're recreating a delta, which is helping with water quality because they're creating all this wetland habitat, but they are also providing habitat for June sucker, and they're also providing bird habitat. And so that's another example of a great project happening on the ground. And I'll just share with everybody some links to all of these projects that are currently happening.
Yeah, and we'll be getting to, I see the question recurring a little bit, you know, what is the biggest bang for the buck for restoration moving forward? But before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about other activities going on right now. So a lot of carp removal. Can anybody speak more to the details of the carp removal? What's the end goal there? Are we ever going to be able to remove all the carp from Utah Lake? Is that the goal? Is that necessary? What role does carp play in the turbidity?
So my understanding is that, I don't know if someone knows more than me about it, but.
Well, I just wanted to make one other comment while we're on the issue of carp removal. If you use a poison like rotenone to kill all the carp, assuming that it even would work, all that carp has to be removed from the lake. You cannot leave carp that have been poisoned with rotenone in the lake. They all have to be collected. So that puts an exclamation point on the difficulty of that sort of approach, trying to eliminate the carp.
Yeah, so I was going to say that I think it's been 15 or maybe 20 years that the EPA has been funding carp removal in Utah Lake. They've gotten to a point where I think they believe they've removed 75% of the carp population. It's now become ineffective to harvest the carp as they were in the past with commercial fishing gear. And so any additional removal is probably going to come down to, fishermen lines. So any carp you catch, yeah, if we could find a way to dispose of those carp in an appropriate manner, that would help the lake, to be honest. But we can't just have them throw them on the shoreline. That would probably cause problems. But yeah, I think we're kind of at a standstill with the carp removal. I do believe the EPA suggests that the work has improved the water quality of the lake by removing the carp.
Yeah, we are challenged with some of the instrumentation that we have to remove the carp for different sizes. It's very difficult to remove certain sizes of carp without impacting some of the other fish populations. Ben, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, David Richards has brought this up several times, and it's a really important point. You have species that become invasive partly because of their characteristics, right? Carp are amazing breeders. Somebody who has 4 children myself, I think they belong right here in Utah Valley, right? A good Utah Valley fish. But the other aspect is, for a species to become invasive, the ecosystem needs to be damaged and compromised in some way. And so thinking about moving toward a sustainable place for Utah Lake, we need to both be thinking about, yes, removing the invasive species, but also reintroducing the native species and helping that natural food web reestablish. And that's what I think is most encouraging about what we're seeing now. It's not just a positive trend in hydrology or biogeochemistry or a single species population. It's all of those things together, right? The June set, and I'd encourage everyone, check out the link that Keith shared to the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program. That's an ongoing, highly successful, celebrated program that's been held up as an example around the country of what successful community-based, science-driven restoration looks like. And so one of the things I hope everyone leaves this meeting with is the knowledge that a lot is being done on Utah Lake now, and it's bearing measurable fruit in multiple dimensions. So it's a question of, are we going to have the discipline to wait for those efforts to bear fruit, to expand them, to provide those state agencies and local partners with the support that they need? Or are we going to be distracted and I'd say even misled by some of these miracle cure solutions?
Right, I think that's a good.
And I've got a little bit to add to that.
Go ahead, please.
So I think Phragmites is a good example also of invasive species and how it fits into the bigger picture. What we've learned, and I've spent a lot more time working on Great Salt Lake, but what we've learned is there's certain driving factors that help facilitate Phragmites invasion. And so what we're seeing is perennial freshwater flows into these wetlands, as well as high amounts of nutrients. And so those are the conditions that caused Phragmites invasion. And then we can aim our solutions at how do we collaborate to steer the system away from that. So what we've been trying to do is not only remove Phragmites, which we know we need to do, and that does take a pretty hands-on active approach, but start looking towards what is within our control to steer the ecosystem or the conditions away from just becoming Phragmites again. And what's been really cool is I don't think we have all of those answers right off the bat. We've been kind of collectively learning as we've been doing it. And so we have this cool iterative science where we're taking science, we're putting it on the ground, and then we're seeing how the system responds, and then we're adapting and looking ahead to our next steps.
Excellent. There was a question that came up about what the carp that's removed, what does that end up getting used for? Does anyone know if that goes to dog food or cat food or?
Yeah,
Thanks,
as I
David.
mentioned in the comments, I made a comment that originally carp were introduced in the lake as a food source, but what they found after testing, after the carp were established as an invasive species, they found that it was not good for food because of too much contamination. And so the carp cannot actually be used for pet food either, or human food. And so they've just been harvesting it and dumping it.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I'd like to just back up for a second and then zoom right back into Utah Lake. But Ben brought up one example of restoration done really well. Can we talk a little bit about, what restoration looks like when it's done well? What are some of the guiding principles or general philosophies of restoration done well?
Actually, I'd like to ask the panel, I mean, if we could increase the amount of water flowing into Utah Lake and then on to the Great Salt Lake, will that help? We've heard already that making the lake deeper when we put in the barrier caused some issues, maybe some changes in the ecology of the lake. So I'm just wondering, the Provo River Delta project will be adding more water. The Hobble Creek project is adding more water to Utah Lake. So would adding more water to the lake be helpful? What do you think, panel?
That's a great question.
I'd just say the target, so there kind of are two approaches to restoration. This is a simplification, but there's a hard path engineering approach where you try to force the ecosystem to do what you want, even though its structure has changed. And that has a very bad track record. And the example that's been brought up several times by Hans Pearl, who serves with Dr. Brainy on the Utah Lake Science Panel and others, is Lake Taihu in China, where rather than doing the long-term reestablishing the food web, reducing nutrients, returning water flow to the lake, they diverted a portion of the Yangtze River into the lake, just thinking, oh, we can flush it out. And that ended up exacerbating the algal blooms and cut off the water supply to 20 million people for several weeks. And the other extreme example is managing toward what the technical term is called naturalness. And I really like that term because it's saying, what can we learn from nature? And speaking to Elder Kuch's comments, and also I see James Mooney, we can learn from the people who have been here the longest, who have the longest and best track record of managing those ecosystems. How have they interacted with nature? And then try to reestablish those conditions. And so one of the most important things we could do is mimic the natural hydrology of Utah Lake, where much more water went to the lake. And here's where management and restoration of the Great Salt Lake is going to necessarily be good for Utah Lake, right? As we're restoring more water to naturally get to the Great Salt Lake, that's going to allow us to have a more natural snowmelt peak during the spring and establish some of the habitat around the lake that favors native vegetation, native communities, rather than the invasive ones.
James, Ben mentioned you specifically. I know you've had your hand up for a little bit. I'm trying to keep it on the panelists primarily, but did you have a short comment following up on that?
I just, I guess you can hear me now. I'm really impressed with what Ben has said, and I really support what he just expressed in turn, doing everything we can to learn from the past. And, but in order to do that, I first moved into Utah Valley in 1973. And they were still putting human waste into that lake at that time. And then Geneva was continuing to put that their waste into the lake up until I think about 82 or 83. So my question is, and I think there's some studies, how deep was the lake prior to the Mormons coming in to Utah Valley? And then my suggestion would be is to, and I'm just saying this as just a person that is not at the quality of understanding things other than I love to fish. And I have chose not to fish in Utah Lake because I can't eat the fish that come out of that. And so I have two questions that I think would be helpful to this group to answer. How deep was the lake prior to the Mormons coming in? And two, to me, the major focus is to bring health to the lake at the status that it was when the Mormons came in. And then put a timetable. And I know that when one of the meetings I went to, there was a woman that had a system of cleansing the lake water, and people just ignored her. And she was extremely frustrated because she's had a track record, supposedly, in cleaning that lake. And my concern is, I would love to start fishing that lake, but I'm not going to fish it if I know I can't eat the fish.
Thank you for that.
Huh?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Dave. My understanding is that, well, Utah Lake's about 9 feet deep on average now. And, 150 or so years ago, it would have been around 5 or 6 feet deep on average. Panelists, correct me if you've got a better number on that, but it would have been something just a little bit shallower than what we're seeing today. Maximum depth of about 18 feet, average of about 9 feet.
So what's it going to take to clean it, and how long is it going to take?
Yeah, I love those questions. Let me just finish this little bit about what good restoration really looks like. And I'd love any other panelists to jump in on this, but we've heard a little bit about this already. It really has to engage stakeholders.
Patrick, oh, sorry.
Did you want to jump in there, Keith?
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
there's a delay on my end. What does good restoration look like? I just wanted to add that as a restoration practitioner, I've been to many conferences, and you'll be able to speak much more to this in the watershed science department. But really what I've learned over the last 5 to 6 years, especially coming from an engineering background, is the successful restoration that's being implemented on the ground is us finding the key components of the processes for these ecosystems, and letting those do the work. And that's really, I know, a lot of the stuff coming out of the watershed sciences departments, but just some examples are like, if we know that beavers play a really, really important role with constructing habitat for a river system, we can either reintroduce beavers, or we can build beaver dam analogs. So I just think, like, we're learning more and more that, like, forcing it with engineering solutions isn't working as well as areas where they're just letting the natural system do its thing. And that takes collective learning to get to that. And so if we could get together to collaborate on that collective learning for Utah Lake, I think that's a path forward.
Wonderful. Thanks, Keith. I'll just build on that. I think good restoration needs to engage all relevant stakeholders, and it really needs to be drawing on a variety of different types of knowledge. You can't just ask the chemists, how do we fix Utah Lake? You can't just ask the fish people, how do we fix Utah Lake? It really has to be a network of scientists and all these other stakeholders, and understanding traditional knowledge, I think, has a lot to bring to bear on restoration of a system.
One last comment about that for me. Restoration is a very interesting notion, but the lake is not in terribly bad condition, and the narrative that we bring to the lake is very important in how restoration proceeds. It is important to know that the lake is a pretty darn important resource, and it's pretty darn fine. I swim in it every summer. When I was a student at BYU back in the day, it was one of my most important protein sources. I fished for white bass. And to this day, I fish well, no, I haven't fished in it for some years. Brian is right about the PCBs and so forth, but basically speaking, the lake is not bad and is coming around. And the more we recognize that the narrative of this thing just needing some tweaking and not needing to be dredged or any of those kinds of things or roten owned is pretty darn important.
Agreed. If I can just finish this a little bit, I think the last piece of good restoration is that it needs to be assessed against clear goals and objectives, feasible, reasonable objectives relative to what we understand about the system.
And I might also add, does no harm.
Yeah, I like that way to
Good
put it,
restoration does no harm. It's like
Yep.
the Hippocratic Oath.
That's right. Absolutely.
Heal the
Brian, you've
patient
had your
without
hand up a little
harming
bit.
the patient.
That's right.
I wanted to comment on when we were on the topic of the relationship between the Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake. I wanted to make a comment pertinent to that, in that it's important to understand that if Utah Lake were to be dredged, it would take a minimum of 8 years and more likely much longer. And during that time, it would very likely curtail the inflow to the Great Salt Lake from the Jordan River. And if that's the case, the Great Salt Lake shrinking would be accelerated, and all the problems that we have heard about from the shrinking Great Salt Lake and the dust that will be created from the dry lake bed and the toxicity in that dust from heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, cadmium, etc., will be accelerated and made worse. And so every person in Salt Lake County has a dog in the fight as to how we preserve and protect, or if we preserve and protect Utah Lake, because it will directly affect air quality throughout the Wasatch Front, in particular, Salt Lake County.
Yeah. Excellent. Let's move to the question that lots of people have been asking in different ways. What are the scientifically sound and financially viable approaches to restoring this lake that can be implemented over the next 5 to 10 years that we'll be seeing measurable improvements? To the extent that we can speak to, what level of investment is going to be necessary and what do we get for different levels of investment, that would be great. So let's start talking about the wide variety of scientifically sound and financially viable approaches. Who wants to jump in on that? Otherwise,
I'm willing to take a shot at it.
Okay.
So I'm a technology person. I develop technologies. I'm interested in technological solutions that improve the lake quality, but do not harm the lake. And so that's one of the main driving forces between developing the algae harvesting boat, where we remove algae from the system. It's only a spot cleaning check, but I think it helps the public. Those areas that we cleaned this past summer, like Linden Marina, had no warnings or issues or problems. And I saw people swimming in Linden Marina just a couple of weeks ago and having a great time. So this is a technology solution that doesn't solve the overall problem, but it helps make the lake a little more pleasant until some of the longer term processes that are being implemented, like that we've mentioned, that are already being implemented, can really improve and have an impact on the lake. I've also considered other technological ideas for removing nutrients, things like floating islands, vegetation. Those could be quite expensive. I've discussed ideas of, and once again, you have to be really careful, because if you introduce something like duckweed, which grows great and absorbs a lot of nutrients, then are we harming the environment or not, the natural ecology of the lake? So pretty much any of these technological ideas have to be really cross-checked and verified to make sure that they aren't causing more harm than they're fixing. So I do believe in technological solutions, at least maybe even short-term or spot cleaning the lake, but that will at least improve the public's perception of the lake, so that these longer-term processes can have the effect we really want.
Great. Let's have some others chime in on this question of what are some of the steps that we need to be taking.
One thing that I would point to right now is this Division of Water Quality study that's underway. And I have some info on that that I just want to read to everybody, actually. So this is Division of Water Quality coordinator sent this to me. So the Division of Water Quality is coordinating a multi-year science-based study to understand the root cause of harmful algal blooms in the lake and identify practical and feasible restoration strategies. So they are currently in the process of that. And the way I'm understanding it is their first step is the learning piece, and their next step is, okay, what's the state of the lake that we want to aim for? And then the third step is how do we put actions on the ground? And so I think that is not necessarily it's not some new idea, right? This is happening right now. Division of Water Quality is underway doing this. And I know Janice, isn't that part of your funding is from that program. And so I think it's this science informing management is really the path forward. And that is happening. We just need more of that. And in order for more of that to happen, we need public agencies that are currently in place to be receiving continued support and more support. And that's, coordinators that are on the ground, learning these systems from the ground up, posing questions to scientists, and then applying those on the ground, and then this iterative approach. And so it's science, and then it's management, and then it's management informing the science, and vice versa. And it takes a lot of different people to come together to make that happen.
I'd like to comment on that briefly. I absolutely agree with what you just said. And please understand that Utah Lake is not the only lake like this in the world. There are studies on eutrophication and algal blooms going on right across the world, on every continent except Antarctica. We are in a time when lakes are under eutrophication. A lot of it is human caused. Not all of it is human caused. But what we need to do, in my opinion, we need to work by reestablishing the lake to fix the deltas, to fix the wetlands at the edge, to increase macrophyte vegetation, emergent vegetation, which will diminish wave action and so forth. And Dave Richards also points out, and others of you have, that if we make nurseries for the other fish, as in macrophytes at the edge or emergent vegetation, they will eat carp minnows too. So the system will right itself if we aid it, if we do the things that we already know to do. So I'm a big fan of nature will heal itself if we give it some help.
I agree. And I was going to say that, there must be some eutrophication in Antarctica, and there you go, Ben put a link to it. So even in Antarctica, there's some level of eutrophication. It happens everywhere. It's a matter of managing it.
Sure.
Brian, you have a hand up? Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Keith said. The fact that the dredging island creation proposal as a solution to the lake's, quote, problems was proposed by developers and not scientists, probably more than any single thing says whether or not that's a scientifically sound approach. Those scientists who do not have an investment incentive in the solution have not supported that as one of the scientifically based solutions. So that in and of itself is very telling as to whether or not that particular approach is scientifically sound.
Well said, Brian.
Agreed.
I think what I would add to that too is that how we got to a proposal like that from a private agency is the lake being in disrepair in the first place. And so again, I would point to action happening on the ground through the public agencies and the channels that really already exist to manage the lake. So you've got Division of Water Quality managing water quality in the state, in forestry, fire, and state lands, managing the bed of Utah Lake. And then there's a lot of other land managers around the lake. And they need people and funding and support to put science, as Sam pointed out, the science already exists, and a lot of what we need to know we already have. We just have to go put it into action on the ground.
And I just have one small thing to add to that. Many agencies across the world, they have numeric goals. That is, we need to get the phosphorus input to X number. We need to get the nitrogen input to X number, and that's what they shoot for. But that's not the way to fix any body of water. The way you fix the bodies of water is to fix the watersheds and the edges of the lake and so forth. You're not shooting for numbers. You're shooting for a healthy ecosystem.
That's right. There are many aspects to it, and they're all interrelated. Ben, please go ahead.
You know, I'm just thinking again about what is of specific interventions, but there are two general approaches that I think are crucial. And Keith just mentioned one of them. We need more personnel. I mean, how many people are working at Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Keith, on the ground?
So depending on how you slice it, we have around 8 to 9 people. And not long ago, we had fewer than that. And so that's what we have for 1.5 million acres in the state. Bear Lake, Bear River, Great Salt Lake, Jordan River, Utah Lake,
Whoa.
and big sections of the Green and Colorado River. And so I'm one of the first people working for the division that's on the ground, implementing changes on land. And I think for me, what gives me hope and what makes me optimistic is now that we have a few more people and a little bit more funding, we've seen tremendous progress in a really short amount of time. And we're not needing an army of people necessarily. We're talking like if these agencies can have a couple more people and a little bit of funding, a lot can be done with it. And so so my work, for example, I have funding directly from the legislature to put on the ground, but I also match it with a ton of partners. And so for Great Salt Lake, for example, I take $350,000 of funding directly from the legislature, put it on the ground, but I match that with federal funding and then funding through some nonprofits as well. And we're putting over $1.5 million a year on the ground and have a lot of other folks that are working to coordinate that. And so that effort is, I don't know, maybe 15 people. We're all working together and we're pooling funding to do that.
So think about what Keith just told us. A few more people, right? A few more positions of people that can be focused on this, who can be evaluating what the best management options are, could be transformative, really, in making sure that the recovery continues. And also the second thing, so, well, I guess for that first thing, I would encourage everyone here to reach out to your representatives at the state level and ask them to support our state agencies, because this management makes a difference. You know, it determines what kinds of places we can go to and enjoy in our community and the health of this irreplaceable ecosystem. The second thing that we can do is change the public perception of the lake. And so I think that focusing on restoring our community's relationship with Utah Lake is one of the most important things we can do. And that's something that we don't need any more money to do. We just need to take the time. If you can't visit it in person, look at some of the online resources, but go out there in person if you can. It is really life-changing to be out there. And you're here in this valley that's becoming increasingly urban. And then all of a sudden you're in a jungle on the shore of this lake and looking out across. And so that's something that I'd also invite everyone on this call to do, is check out the Utah Lake Photography Club. It's on Instagram if you're an old person, or sorry, if you're a young person, and
Hey.
Facebook if you're an old person like me. So let's put the money where it's going to make a difference. Let's use our time and rediscover this amazing lake, its history, its ecology.
Yeah, I think there's an unfortunate interpretation of fiscal conservatism that just thinks, you know, we should just cut funding to all these things. And I think of fiscal conservatism as making the right investments so we're protecting these great natural resources so they don't end up essentially in the emergency room. The emergency room is by far and away the most expensive place to take care of people. It's the most expensive place to take care of ecosystems. Great Salt Lake is in the emergency room now. We're using tactics that are going to be 10, 50, maybe 100 times more expensive than it would have been to have taken care of Great Salt Lake over the last 2 decades. Same thing can be said of Utah Lake. It's in a trauma center, maybe. It's not quite the emergency room yet, but it's we have to use some more expensive tactics. Jim, I believe you had.
Yeah, I had a question. If Utah Lake is such an important major public trust asset to the state of Utah, why is the legislature not being, why is Utah Lake not being more appropriately funded to help in its restoration? Panel?
Brian, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, my comment was a follow-up to your comment, Patrick, about likening the Great Salt Lake to being in the emergency room. Not only is that true with regard to the health hazard that it represents to the populace of Utah, but it's also an economic disaster. I'll give you just one example. About a month ago, I got a call from a totally anonymous person from Los Angeles who just got a job offer in Utah. And he called me up saying, I have heard these many national stories about the dust from the Great Salt Lake and the public health hazard that is becoming, and about the trend of it becoming worse and worse and worse. And he said, is it safe for me to move my family to Utah? Now, you multiply that one particular person that called me up by the thousands who didn't call me up, and we have an economic disaster on our hands following a public health disaster. So yes, the Great Salt Lake is in the emergency room, but our economy will follow if we don't take care of it.
Absolutely. All these things are connected. We can be making
I'm willing
much
to make a
more
comment on
decisions.
the question about the legislature. They have not done a lot to spend a lot of money to help Utah Lake or the Great Salt Lake, but you know, in their favor, they have started to. Last year, they spent several million. They allocated several million to different projects on Utah Lake. This year, even more. They did even more, and certainly they're starting to spend dollars on saving the Great Salt Lake. So I think they're late to the issue, but I think they are becoming aware of it, and they're starting to move in the right direction. So I wish they'd come sooner, but at least they're coming now.
Yeah. Representative Judkins, are you on with us still? You might have some comments on this.
I am with you, if you want to. So, hello. This has been really interesting and great. I'm happy to join, and I want to learn as much as I can. I don't want to put words into any of my fellow legislators' mouths or pretend like I know everything that's going on with what they're saying. But we did, like Richard just said, we did appropriate $30 million to Utah Lake. We appropriated over $50 million to the Great Salt Lake. in this last year. And that honestly is a lot of money for the legislature to do. And it is late. And that's unfortunate. But I know it's really got the attention now. And I wish that I could say it had the attention 10 years ago or 20 or whenever, but there really is attention now. The speaker has another Great Salt Lake Summit planned for, I think it's in October. He's really taking this very seriously, and what he supports generally does get funded. So I know, and honestly, I know everybody's worried about Restoration Lake Solutions, if that's what it's called or whatever, I can't quite remember. But I haven't heard one legislator say they support that at this point. Like, everyone thinks that they're so supportive of it, but they don't have a good business, but like their financing is all based on the state backing their bond. And we're too fiscally conservative to do that for billions and trillions of dollars. Like, I don't know. I'm not saying that in 10, 15 years, somebody won't support it, but just, I have not heard anything that anybody has come out and said, oh gosh, I so support this at all. Not one legislator. So I don't know, hopefully that will help some people feel a little better about it. And we do have the new Utah Lake Authority, which has a not very legislator heavy, we don't have legislators on that. It's the mayors, elected officials, and different people in Utah County, and some of the people from the state that can actually raise money to also help with Utah Lake. So they have taxing authority. So anyway, that's just some of the stuff. I don't know. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I don't know if I can answer them though, actually, but I can give you my opinion.
I have a question. I have a question for her. How has the recent revelation from the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands that the Attorney General's office is indicating that the LRS proposal to restore Utah Lake is unconstitutional and likely illegal and would be detrimental to Utah? How is that affecting those in the state legislature?
There's always there not always, but there can be a little bit of friction between the AG's office and legislators and the governors and stuff like that. So the legislature does not take direction well from the Attorney General and vice versa sometimes. But so we have talked about it a little bit, and it's just been like interesting because nobody's committed to that anyway. So it's just interesting. We're just letting the process play out. They've submitted their stuff and we're just like, oh, whatever. I don't know. I have not heard a whole lot about it.
There's no buzz?
Not really, no. So we'll see. I think just because nobody is committed one way or the other at this point. We're talking about how do we help the Great Salt Lake, and and this other thing is so far in the future if ever any information comes out of it. And I don't think anybody's really taking it that seriously. Anyway, just wanted to get information about it. But that's just my take. So please don't think that I know all. But
none of us do.
So,
yeah.
Right. That's right. It takes a village. We are at 8:30 now. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd like to give any of the panelists who would like to make any other statement a minute or two to do that. And then I'd just like to open it up. If you would like to speak now, if you could just raise your hand, and we can go in order of hands that I see. So any other closing statements from panelists? Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one final comment regarding kind of applying collaboration to specifically improving Utah Lake. So before I had talked about, scientists collaborating with people on the ground that can actually apply it to make change. And I think that there's other collaborations that need to happen from my perspective in an executive branch agency. So I think in the executive branch, we need to be better at collaborating with the legislative branch and vice versa. And then we have to also learn about all of the challenges of where these different perspectives are coming from. So I talked about, I am in an agency that is understaffed for the land that we have, but I'm asking professors at universities to provide me with science that I can apply on the ground. But those professors are, and maybe I can ask this to the professors, like, what are the challenges you face to interact with someone like me? And the way I understand it is you're pressured with, you have to pump out students and degrees, and you have to do research. And that takes a lot of your time. And how much time do you then have to collaborate with someone like me in an agency to go put change on the ground? So I think that there's like a lot of those relationships there. And what makes me feel optimistic is I'm seeing a lot of those relationships improve in Utah.
And I'll just speak really briefly to that, Keith, because it's a really important point. Academics have been highly incentivized to publish papers. And that's certainly an important part of scientific communication. But I can speak to us here at Watershed Sciences at Utah State. We are really shifting the conversation over to what kind of impact are you having? We're the land grant institution. We feel like that is a core part of our mission. It's a hard thing to quantify. It's easier to just count papers, count citations. And we've said, but that's not getting us where we want to go. And so I'm really incentivizing faculty here. We have a great new dean here at College of Natural Resources who is interested in incentivizing faculty to make real positive impacts that society understands the value of what we're doing. But you're absolutely right. That's a critical transition academia needs to go through.
Patrick, I want to say thanks to Dr. Karen Kettenring in your Watershed Sciences department. She's going really above and beyond as far as taking the extra time to work directly with me to apply her science on the ground.
Absolutely. She has been a leader in that. Kevin, I saw your hand up next, and then we'll go to Brian and then Mike Buckley. And then
Yeah, I just want to make a comment along the lines of what Ben has been saying. What can we do? Well, my students and I were out on Utah Lake almost every weekday this whole summer, from May to August to just recently. And it is an amazing, beautiful, incredible place to be. So we need to reconnect with the lake. If you're here listening still, go spend some time on the lake. It is fantastic. And as we do that, we can change the perception about the lake. And I think, change the perception of the lake will help us move forward in these, some of the efforts that are being done to improve water quality, I think can be pushed along even faster. But I think we really do need to reconnect with the lake. It is an amazing resource, an amazing, beautiful place to be. And I think go spend some time on the lake this weekend.
So I just wanted to say we have been, for most of the evening, kind of referring obliquely to the proposal to dredge and create artificial islands on Utah Lake as a solution to its problems. But what we haven't addressed at all is the fact that at its core, it's a means of ushering in a new city of 500,000 people. Now, I don't care whether you put those 500,000 people on top of Utah Lake, in the foothills, or cram them all in the Bingham Canyon open pit mine. They will have a carbon footprint. They will have a pollution footprint. They will have a water consumption need. And there is no way that we can have the kind of quality of life that we all expect out of the Wasatch Front and add a new city of 500,000 people to the equation and expect it to not have an impact regardless of where you put them. So putting them on Utah Lake may be the worst possible place to put them, but putting them anywhere is a serious problem for all of us.
Thank you, Brian. I've got Mike Buckley next, and then Jake Holdaway, and then Jim.
Okay, this is Mike Buckley. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for the comments. But I will have to say, I have, read information, and there definitely is a lot of conflict in information. I'm not saying, it's not easy to shift through everything. You hear different things. My biggest concern when I first got on tonight was I thought they were going to talk about the islands. I'm totally opposed to that. One is I just feel like dredging up that silt and building a city on that cannot have a firm foundation, for one thing. But I do appreciate all the other information. On the Phragmites, I have kind of a concern. We live on the west side on the lake, and we haven't seen a decrease in the Phragmites at all for miles along the west side. So I'm not sure kind of what's going on there. At least my understanding in the conversation tonight is that most of them have been taken care of. And maybe I misunderstood, but there still are a ton of Phragmites on the west side. But again, thank everybody for their information. And I guess it's important for us as citizens to sift through everything to make sure kind of what is what. I'm not saying, anyone on here is wrong, but you do read various information and hear various information, which is conflicting. But thank you very much.
Yeah, the
Hey,
Islands
Mike,
Project has been shown to be the bad idea that it was. It's a part of the history now, flash in the pan for Utah Lake, and we can move past it. We've got lots of other restoration practices to put into play in the future.
I'd be happy
Jacob.
to just directly address the question regarding Phragmites on the west side of the lake. So the remaining Phragmites that is on Utah Lake is higher in elevation than a lot of the Phragmites that's been removed. And that's because we're not able to effectively kill Phragmites that is drier. So drier Phragmites is harder to get rid of. And that's one area that we're looking into, like what are our strategies to deal with that. And so what's left on Utah Lake, the remaining 20 to 30% that's still there, a lot of it is this kind of ring of Phragmites that's a little more upland, not down in the wetlands. And so on the west side of the lake, there's more of that higher elevation Phragmites. So it's just a little bit more challenging to remove.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Jake next.
I just want to say and commend you all. I think it's been very helpful as a private landowner. I think we need to engage a lot of the wetland owners that are around the lake and educate them and bring them into the scientific community and help their steward role instead of a wetland owner role of what they could potentially do with those. And then my second comment was, I actually like that you guys are not as political scientifically. The group you guys, I mean, just learning, your group tends to be not as many talkers and feel like the data should speak for itself, which it does, which is awesome. But at the same time, I would, there's that line of crossing a line and then taking that to being. So I think it's great that this group isn't a political group, but yet I still think you need to be a little bit more though, because sometimes it's hard. There's a lot of noise. And if we can help in any way, we want to, but it's better to have the right data than to be a loud voice.
Thanks for that. And we'll go to Jim.
Okay. I would like to say that kind of a summary of what I've heard is that if we want to see Utah Lake restored in a healthful way without harming it, You don't go around and kill all the fish in the lake with rote. No, that's maybe number one. Number two, you don't dredge the lake and make it deeper. Number three, you don't do anything that will harm the Great Salt Lake. And number four, you don't build a huge city complex in the middle of the lake, in part because all of the environmental damage that will do. So that's sort of my take on what I have heard this evening. Oh, and I want to thank everybody for our panelists and everyone in the audience too for being here. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sam, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just one thing. I want you to know that, as I say, I started working on Utah Lake 70 years or in 1970, 50 years ago. Yeah, it seems like 70. But I was a voice in the dark for 30 years. And you can't imagine how nice it is to hear this panel and the people who have called in and to see all of the work that's going on. Utah Lake is a jewel. We're going to save it.
I love that. I think we'll end there. I really want to thank everyone for calling in, for your interest, for your support for Utah Lake, for science driving policy and management decisions, building community, bringing people together, talking substantively about the issues. That's how we move forward. This has been a wonderful example of it.
I'd like to encourage people to go to the Utah Valley Earth Forum website, UVEF.org, and also to consider, joining our organization, and also to visit the website of Conserve Utah Valley. I think it's conserveutahvalley.org, and ours again is UVEF.org or UtahValley.org, UtahValleyEarthForum.org. And thank you all panelists, and thank everyone who has attended, and thank you, Forrest, is it Kutch? Thank you very much for your participation, and James Mooney for sharing some of the Native American perspective. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Oh, and our next Zoom forum, we hope, will be on the issue of water, how to use it wisely, how not to use it harmfully or wastefully, and how to conserve water. That'll probably be next month, and we hope we have the same kind of public support and turnout for that Zoom as we had for this one. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jim. Take care.